At exactly 11:47 p.m., the piano in the parlor began to play. No one was sitting there. No one had touched it in decades. Outside, the fog clung to the windows like something trying to get in, or perhaps trying to keep something from leaving. The melody was faint, broken in places, as if played by hands remembering more than they should. In a crumbling house above the Devonshire cliffs, where salt gathers on the walls and time folds in on itself, an old woman lies awake, listening. She knows the song. She just doesn't know how the new tenant knows it too. And he swears. He doesn't even play piano. Welcome to Echoes of Kindness. Come closer. There's a story in room number 6 that's been waiting all these years to be heard. Let's begin. She lives alone now. The locals say she's always been there in that weather-worn house with the chipped blue shutters and the brass door knocker shaped like a swan. Children used to whisper stories about her. Some said she was a widow. Others claimed she was waiting for someone who never returned. But most simply called her Mrs. Merriweather and walked a little quicker past her gate. Eliza Merriweather is 73. She walks with a slight limp, the cane tapping softly against the wooden floors like a metronome no one else can hear. Her days are quiet, filled with slow routines and long silences. She still brews tea the old way, still folds her linens with care, and still leaves the parlor door closed. That's the rule. The only rule really, if you rent the upstairs room, you mustn't touch the piano. The house overlooks the cliffs of Devonshire, where the sea often blurs into sky and everything feels caught between tides. She keeps the windows clean, though she rarely looks out. There's a kind of gentleness to her solitude, but also something unfinished, like a sentence stopped mid-breath. Once, Eliza was a music teacher. Her students adored her not just for her patience, but for the way she made music feel like memory, warm, familiar, and deeply personal. She used to play every evening, fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys, a waltz for the fading light. Then came 1958, and everything after that became quieter. She never speaks of the war, not the one that tore Europe apart, nor the smaller, more private one that stole the sound from her house. Somewhere in a drawer upstairs, tucked beneath old scarves and pressed flower petals, lies a photograph, a man in uniform and a woman in a summer dress, smiling as if nothing could touch them. She's never shown it to anyone, but she remembers his name, James. In the years that followed, Eliza made a quiet vow, one she never spoke aloud, not even to herself. She would keep the house, keep the room, and keep the music inside, locked, undisturbed, a shrine built not of candles, but of silence. Still, time has a way of testing our walls. Every so often, when the wind howls just right, she hears something from the parlor, not the piano itself, but the echo of it, a phrase, a chord, a name that never made it home. So when the young man arrived that October afternoon, soft-spoken, suitcase in hand, storm-gray eyes that carried too much for someone so young, Eliza felt something shift. She didn't say it, she didn't show it, but something ancient and aching stirred, just beneath the surface. And the rule from, she told him, as always, don't touch the piano. But for the first time in 40 years, she didn't quite mean it. It happened on the very first night. The wind was rising, whispering through the cracks in the window panes, carrying with it the sharp scent of salt and the faint rustle of old ivy clawing at the stone walls. Eliza had just finished her tea, she always did, precisely at 10, and was settling into the familiar creak of her armchair by the fire. The house, as always, settled with her, breathing its tired sighs and groans into the quiet. She didn't notice the time until the clock in the hall began to chime. 11:30. Then, at 11:47 p.m., a sound slipped into the silence. Soft, hesitant, like a memory taking its first breath after years beneath the dust. The piano. She froze. Not from fear, not entirely, but from the kind of stillness that comes when something impossible happens. The kind of stillness that wraps around the spine and whispers, "Don't move. Listen." The melody was delicate, fragile even, as though each note had traveled a long way to find her. But the tune, oh, the tune, was unmistakable. Adeline's Waltz. Her fingers had once danced that very melody into countless evenings. It wasn't a popular piece. It had never been published. Only one person ever knew how to play it the way she did. And he had vanished from her life like smoke. She stood slowly, cane in hand, and made her way down the narrow canal. The parlor door stood ajar, the sliver of moonlight on the floor trembling ever so slightly. As she pushed the door open, her heart knocking against her ribs, she expected, what? A ghost? A burglar with a fondness for waltzes? But the room was empty. The piano sat in the corner, its lid closed. The fire had long gone out. No warmth, no sound, no sign of disturbance. Only the faint echo of the last few notes, lingering like perfume in the air. Upstairs, the floor creaked. Thomas. She found herself staring at the ceiling. Perhaps he couldn't sleep. Perhaps he has a radio. Perhaps, but even as she thought it, she knew better. Radios do not play Adeline's waltz. She didn't ask him the next morning. She watched him instead. The way he buttered his toast carefully, the way he held the cup with both hands, as if the tea might slip through his fingers otherwise. He was always gentle in movement, deliberate, but there was something else, something quiet and unfinished behind his eyes. That night the music returned, and the night after that. Every evening at precisely 11:47 p.m., the melody filled the house like fog, never louder than it should be, never early, never late. Eliza didn't sleep much after that. Instead, she listened, sometimes standing in the hallway, sometimes just sitting in the dark, her hand resting on the cold porcelain of her teacup. She told herself she wouldn't ask. What good would it do? The boy was polite, respectful, paid his rent on time, quiet, too quiet perhaps, but that was a kindness these days. But on the fourth morning, he hummed the tune. It was faint, barely there, just a few bars under his breath as he rinsed his cup at the sink. She turned sharply. Where did you hear that? Thomas looked up, startled, almost embarrassed. I'm not sure. I didn't realize I was humming. You were. Her voice was hoarse, more wind than word. The waltz. He furrowed his brow. I don't know the name. It just comes to me sometimes. In dreams, I think. Eliza said nothing. But that night, she sat on the edge of her bed holding the old photograph in her lap. James in his uniform. Her, younger, sun-warmed, eyes full of a life still unwritten. And somewhere between the fifth and sixth night, she stopped checking the parlor altogether. Because what terrified her more than hearing the music was the idea that it might stop. On the sixth night, something changed. She couldn't sleep, not even pretend to. The music came as expected. But this time, the notes were fuller, steadier. It no longer felt like a memory trying to play itself. It felt intentional, as if someone had found the thread of the song and was slowly, lovingly weaving it whole again. And when morning came, she found him there. Thomas, sitting by the piano, not playing, just sitting. One hand resting gently on the closed lid. Beside him, a folded letter. He looked up when she entered, and something passed between them. Not surprise, not guilt, but recognition, a quiet knowing. I didn't touch it, he said softly. Not really, but I felt like I was supposed to leave this here. Eliza said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the letter. The paper was old, the handwriting unmistakable. James, her knees gave a little, and she reached for the edge of the piano to steady herself. Thomas moved to help her, but she waved him off gently. Where did you get that? She asked finally. He hesitated. It was in my mother's things. After she passed, I don't know why, but I brought it with me. I didn't even know who it was for. The house fell silent again. Only the ticking of the clock and the hush of waves somewhere below the cliffs. And Eliza realized, whatever this was, it had begun long before he stepped through her door. Some stories wait to be told. Others, they find their way, no matter how long it takes. And for the first time in years, she wondered if the past wasn't haunting her, but calling her home. In the days that followed, something fragile began to form between Eliza and Thomas. It wasn't trust, not quite, and certainly not ease, but it was something, like a bridge forming out of mist, hesitant, intangible, and easily broken. They spoke more now, though only in fragments. Eliza would comment on the weather and Thomas would nod. Sometimes he asked if she needed anything from the village, and she'd wave him off with a vague smile. But there were moments, soft, almost imperceptible, when their silences felt less like avoidance and more like company. One morning, she caught him standing at the window into the parlor, staring out at the sea with a kind of longing that made her chest ache. "It never really changes," she said quietly. "That view, it just wears different faces." He turned slightly, "And yet I feel like I've seen it before." There it was again. That unsettling echo in his voice, like a thread pulled from a past neither of them fully remembered. Eliza had long stopped questioning coincidence. Life had a way of bringing things back when they were least prepared to face them. That evening, as she lit the fire, she glanced at the piano. "Do you dream of music often?" she asked, not looking at him. He hesitated. "Not music exactly, just moments, flashes, a room with light pouring in, a woman humming, the smell of soap and rosewood." Her hand faltered slightly over the matchbox. Soap and rosewood. James had worn rosewood cologne. She'd chosen it for him the Christmas before he left. The room held its breath. That night, the music didn't come at 11:47 p.m. The house remained silent, expectant. Eliza lay awake longer than usual, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, the silence somehow heavier than the sound had ever been. In the absence of the melody, something began to fray inside her. By the next morning, she found herself strangely irritable. She barked at Thomas when he forgot to latch the back gate. She snapped when he offered to carry in the firewood. Guilt followed her like a shadow, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she opened the drawer, the one with the letter. She read it again, slowly this time. James had written of a child, a boy born in Paris from a brief return after the war, a son he had never met. Thomas hadn't said where he was born. She wanted to ask. She didn't. Instead, she offered tea. He accepted, cautiously, as if he too could sense the shift. They sat across from each other, two strangers tethered by a song neither fully understood. "You said your mother lived in France?" she asked eventually. He nodded. "Near Lyon. She never spoke of my father, just that he was English, a soldier, and that he played the piano." The teacup in her hand trembled. She steadied it. "Did she ever say his name?" "No, just that he loved waltzes. And that he left because he had to, not because he wanted to." Liza felt something unravel, not fast, but undeniable. The days grew colder, the fog thicker. Each evening, Thomas lingered longer in the parlor. One night, she found him tracing the piano's edges with his fingers, almost reverently. "I feel like I'm remembering something that never happened," he said. "Like I was born into someone else's goodbye." Her breath caught. She said nothing. But that night, she unlocked the cabinet beneath the piano. Inside was a velvet pouch. From it, she withdrew a small silver pendant, oval, faded. Inside, a photo, James as a boy, younger than he ever was when she met him. She left it on the piano bench. In the morning, it was gone. But the music returned, not at 11:47 p.m., earlier and fuller, as if the house had finally remembered the rest of the song. And in the melody, something had shifted. No longer haunting, now it was longing. Eliza sat outside the parlor door and wept quietly. She was beginning to understand. But understanding came at a kitan, because what happens when you finally face a truth you've spent decades avoiding? For Eliza, it meant reckoning with the years she'd locked herself away. The letters never sent, the keys never touched, the grief that had become her companion. And for Thomas, it meant asking the question he'd never dared speak aloud. "Did you ever know a man named James Holloway?" The room held its breath once more. Eliza stared into her cup. "Yes," she said finally. And in that word, everything changed. The sea raged louder outside. The fog pressed harder against the glass. But inside, the story had begun to thaw, and the melody carried on. In the days after her confession, a peculiar rhythm settled into the house, a rhythm neither of them dared disrupt. The piano now played with a steadiness that bordered on comforting, but it also seemed to listen, to wait. Eliza began sharing more in pieces, the way one might unravel an old scarf, carefully stitch by fading stitch. She told him about the summer James first came to the village, the way he'd whistled out of tune, how his hands had always smelled of boot polish and tobacco. Thomas listened, always. He didn't write anything down, but Eliza had the sense he was memorizing it all, as if the stories were parts of him waiting to be restored. One afternoon, while they shelled peas at the kitchen table, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're standing in someone else's life?" Thomas gave a quiet laugh. "Every day here." Their laughter was soft but real, a flicker of warmth that didn't vanish too quickly. But not everything thawed so gently. One evening, a storm rolled in, violent and sudden. The sea became a living thing, pounding the cliffs with desperate hands. The wind tore through the cracks of the house, and for a moment, the old timbers groaned so loud Eliza feared they might splinter. The power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the piano began to play. No one was near it. Thomas stood by the window. Eliza, across the room, still clutching the candle she just lit. Neither spoke. The melody was deeper now, almost mournful, and just beneath it, if one listened closely, was the sound of something else. Breathing, Eliza lowered herself into the armchair. Thomas sat on the rug, cross-legged like a boy. Together they listened until the storm passed. When it did, the silence felt different. Not empty, but sacred. She turned to him then, voice barely audible. I think this house has been waiting for you." Thomas didn't answer, but his eyes, suddenly wet, said everything. By the end of that week, he found a key in the back of a drawer. Rusted, unmarked. He brought it to her with a question in his eyes. She recognized it immediately. "That opens the cedar chest in the attic," she whispered. They climbed the stairs together, slow and deliberate. Inside the chest were all the things she'd refused to throw away: concert programs, faded telegrams, a pressed flower from 1957, and a music score with the initials J.H. He held it as if it might vanish. "Did he write this?" "He wrote it for me," she said. "Adeline's Waltz." He called it a promise in disguise. Thomas ran a finger along the notation. "He wrote the first half, but this isn't finished." Eliza nodded. "I never could bring myself to complete it." He looked up at her, a soft resolve behind his grief. "Then maybe it's time we did, together." That night, for the first time, they sat side by side at the piano, not playing, not yet, just ready. The keys awaited. So did the past, and something else too, a future neither of them had known they were missing. As the candlelight danced across the polished wood, Eliza placed her hand gently over Thomas's. "When you're ready," she said. The first note rang out, delicate and sure, and the melody carried on. The days after they discovered the unfinished score became quieter, but not emptier. It was the quiet of shared understanding, of two souls ready leaning towards something unnamed but deeply felt. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, as though the echo of the past was no longer trapped, but slowly being sung back to life. Eliza spent more time in the parlor now. Sometimes she simply sat there watching the light change across the keys. Other times she would take out James's letters and read them aloud to no one in particular. And Thomas no longer wandered like a guest. He moved with the stillness of someone who had roots here, even if he didn't know how they'd grown. But the closer they came to completing the waltz, the heavier the air became. It was a Thursday when Eliza fell. The rug by the stairs had curled just slightly at the edge. Nothing remarkable, nothing she hadn't stepped over 1,000 times. But this time her foot caught, and the cane slipped, and in a blink she was on the floor. Thomas found her moments later, pale and shaken but conscious. He helped her to the armchair, and she insisted she was fine, just bruised. But she avoided his eyes. That night she didn't come down for supper, and for the first time since he arrived, Thomas played the piano on his own. He played slowly, haltingly, but with an aching tenderness, as if trying to summon something buried deep in the floorboards. The next morning, Eliza asked him to bring her the cedar box from the attic. He placed it on her lap without a word. She opened it, not like someone searching, but like someone surrendering. Inside, beneath the letters and photographs, was another envelope, sealed in wax, thicker than the others. She held it in her hands for a long time before speaking. "He never sent this, but I found it in his mother's handwriting. She must have kept it." She passed it to Thomas. He broke the seal carefully. The letter was dated 1964, Paris. It began simply, "My dearest Eliza," what followed was a confession of love, of regret, and of something that turned the air cold around them both. James had returned to France after the war, briefly. There he had met a young woman. They had shared little time together, but enough to leave behind a child. He had tried to find them again, to do right by them, but duty had pulled him away once more. He had written to Eliza not to explain but to prepare her for the possibility that someday a boy with gray eyes and a piece of him in his blood might come to find her. And he ended the letter with a line neither of them would ever forget. If he ever finds you, Eliza, I hope he carries some part of me in his music. The room was silent but ringing, the kind of silence that fills the chest until it aches. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. He simply read the letter again, then again. Eliza watched him, her eyes full, not just of tears, but of something older. Acceptance, maybe, or grief finally having somewhere to go. When he finally looked up, his voice cracked. It was him, wasn't it? James. He was my father. She nodded. The next few days passed like a slow storm. Eliza slept more. Thomas walked longer. Neither spoke much, but the air between them was changed. Not broken, just undone. It was on the sixth evening that Eliza asked him to bring her to the parlor. She sat by the piano, thin and pale, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. Thomas sat beside her. The score was open, the unfinished waltz. His hands hovered over the keys. Finish it, she whispered. Not the way I would have, the way you would. And he did. He added 4 bars, then another, then a lift in the melody that carried the whole thing upward, like breath after grief. Eliza wept silently as he played, but as the final note lingered, her breath caught. Her hand gripped his sleeve. There's something else, she said, in the drawer, behind the ledger. He brought it to her. An envelope, smaller this time. Inside was a photograph. 2 men, one older, unmistakably James. The other, a young man in uniform, French, slim, with dark hair and a familiar gaze. He had a brother, she whispered. Before the war, but he never spoke of him, only that they had lost each other. Thomas studied the photo. That's my grandfather, he said slowly. My mother's father. I've seen this face in her house. She never said who he was with, just that he died in England. The truth hit like a slow wave. Not a slap, but a submersion. James hadn't just left behind a child. He had left behind his brother's legacy, raised that boy, protected him. And when duty pulled him away, he entrusted everything to silence, to Eliza. They sat for hours in the parlor that night. No music, no words, only knowing. And when Eliza finally rose to leave, she turned to Thomas and said, we were both born from unfinished things, but you've made something whole. He reached for her hand, and for the first time she let him hold it. The fog outside lifted slightly. The house, once burdened by silence, now held a new kind of stillness. Not absence, but peace. They didn't speak of what came next, not yet. But the piano was no longer off limits, and the melody no longer belonged to the past. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Not in any visible way. Its bricks still wore the same salt-kissed fatigue, and the sea outside still rolled in with the same tired rhythm. But inside, something had shifted. There was warmth again. It began with the small things. The way the piano lid remained open now, as if in invitation. The way Eliza no longer walked past the parlor but paused to listen, even when no one was playing. The way Thomas, once careful and restrained, now allowed himself to hum freely as he washed dishes or whistle absent-mindedly on his way to fetch the post. The music, once an intruder in the night, had become a friend, a gentle presence. It no longer came at 11:47 p.m. with trembling urgency, but wove itself softly through the hours, like sunlight moving across an old floor. Eliza's steps had slowed, but her gaze was clearer. There was still pain, of course there was, but it no longer ruled her days. She smiled more now. Not often, but when she did, it stayed a little longer. Thomas, too, had changed. He walked with a steadier stride, as if the ache in his chest had found a rhythm it could rest inside. The questions that had haunted him, about blood, about belonging, were no longer edges cutting into his sense of self. They were part of him now, woven into his story, not weighing it down, but giving it shape. One afternoon, as golden light pooled across the parlor, they sat side by side at the piano. The air was still, the fire soft in the grate. Eliza turned to him and said quietly, "He would have been proud, not for the music, for the way you carry it." Thomas didn't reply with words. He simply nodded, then placed her hand gently on the keys. Together, they played the final version of Adeline's Waltz. It was no longer a song about parting. It was a song about return. And when the last note faded, they let the silence be what it was. Whole, forgiving, unafraid. A few days later, Thomas prepared to leave. Not forever, but to return to France, to trace back the names he now carried with a fuller heart. Eliza packed him a small parcel of letters. She didn't explain what was inside. She simply said, "Some stories find us before we're ready, but it's not about being ready. It's about listening." He promised he would. At the gate, as the wind tugged at his coat and the sea hummed in the distance, he turned back one last time. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have," he said. "A beginning." Eliza smiled. "You gave it to yourself. I just made the tea." They both laughed, softly, like old friends do when no goodbye ever really means goodbye. That night, the house did not play the waltz. It didn't need to. The memory was no longer trapped in the piano or the letters or even the song itself. It had passed through them into something quieter, deeper. It had become part of the air. And from that day on, when fog swept in from the sea, the villagers swore the old Merriweather house felt warmer than the others, as if it remembered something beautiful and broken, and loved it anyway. After all, not every ending is a closing. Some are simply a soft place to begin again. Sometimes a story doesn't need to be loud to change something quietly inside us. If this one touched something in you, comment 1 and tell us which moment lingered the longest. If you find this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more. And don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.